Thank you for that warm welcome, not only this morning, but also throughout the conference. It's really wonderful to be among you all. I must open by confessing that Pastor Greg is so kind and persuasive that I accepted his invitation a year ago without due diligence. I did not, as he suggested, watch any of last year's speeches before accepting. And when I finally did, I had one single thought. Uh-oh. Some of those speakers really knew their scripture. An impressive number were speaking without visible notes. And add to that another crowd-pleasing feature that I lack, PowerPoint, of which Professor Kenger was a maestro yesterday. So in all, I've been feeling as if I'm 3 strikes behind before getting to the home base podium here. But that said, the anxiety did have its virtues. It made me think and think again about what to share here today. And as I thought and asked for help, what transpired was the desire to do something entirely new, to take a fresh tour of the horizon and share some of what's out there. So as the title suggests, today's talk is not a lamentation, and that's so for 2 reasons. First, Jeremiads, although sometimes necessary, are pretty thick on the ground these days. That may not have been true for Jeremiah the prophet in 586 BC, when the Babylonian captivity began. But by 2024 AD, bewailing the fallenness of all that surrounds us comes a little too easily, especially for Christians. The second reason for opting against doom and gloom is that sometimes we all need a change of pace, myself included. A lot of my work during the last 15 years has been aimed at trying to understand what's happening to our country underneath the distractions of the news cycle. It's been absorbed by questions like, what's causing secularization? What's causing something obviously related to secularization, the breakdown of the family? Why are so many of today's kids suffering so? Why are ancient moral teachings under attack, and what should we do about that? Etc. And one cannot tackle questions like those without talking about cultural decline, godlessness, and other familiar depressants. So, in considering what to share during our time together at this phenomenal gathering, the thought kept recurring that instead of focusing on our familiar problems, it would be exciting instead to take up a different subject. In some unexpected corners of the culture, signs of moral progress are flashing at a steady rate. And these signals will certainly guide American and other Christianity into the future. This morning, we will examine 6 such signals in some detail. And to open with the inevitable caveat, the existence of these signs does not mean that Christian triumphalism is in order. Nor does their existence mean that today's re-paganization, as I called it 12 years ago in a speech at Brigham Young University, will reverse in the lifetimes of anyone here. Maybe it won't. Maybe we are indeed somewhere on the road to what Pope Benedict XVI famously predicted in 1969, a smaller, holier church. But even a smaller, holier church, or for that matter, a larger, holier church, will have been sustained by something. And that's what we're here to try and discern. We will try and make visible what to many people is elusive and invisible at this moment, the positive signs of religious vibrancy and moral vibrancy in our time. So let's begin with one such sign that I have never seen discussed as such. It is simply this: Young people today may be more unchurched than their elders. In fact, we know that they are. They may be more likely to call themselves socialists. But a significant number are also, on balance, more socially conservative than their parents' generation. And that, my friends, is a remarkable fact that demands inspection. As noted recently in a fascinating set of pieces for the Wall Street Journal, for example, voters under the age of 30 have been stalwart members of the left since the late 1980s. But as of now, that uniformity is no more. Young men, in particular, are now leaning rightward, including on social issues. Among many surprises in the journal's report, consider this one. Of 500 young men surveyed, only 16% said they approved of legalized abortion. 16%. It happens I live with a well-known demographer, Nicholas Eberstadt, and so shocked was I by that number that I dragged him into the dining room and said, "Tell me I'm not reading this chart wrong." And I wasn't. 16%. It's not the best use of Nick's powers, but I had to call on him. These young men in the survey were not selected for their religious views. Presumably, they were as random a group as could be devised. But given that young men under 30 are often the instigators of abortion itself, this low regard that many of them seem to have for it is both unexpected and worth some thought. What is going on here? From a philosophical perspective, I guess, one could argue that it's a reassertion of the primacy of natural law, the triumph of inner conscience somehow. After all, remember, many of these young men are not picking up pro-life views in church. As we know from the statistics on the nuns, many of them aren't even believers. But something else also looks to be unfolding. At least some people seem to be learning from experience, whether it's the experience of sonograms or the demise of perfidious bad law Roe, perhaps even the reassertion of sanity that is the Dobbs case. A sense seems to be growing among at least some younger Americans, mostly male, that today's laissez-faire consensus, the dominant consensus about sex, is missing something. And that is remarkable. Consider, this is the generation that has pornography at its fingertips from childhood, in most cases. It is the generation that has grown up under rules that amount to nothing more than so what? And yet, many members of that generation now lean more toward life than their predecessors since the 1960s. The same journal piece also reveals another surprise. This one isn't so positive. Many young women are being radicalized in the opposite direction. Some 53% of them in the same survey favor abortion. And they also diverge dramatically from the young men on several other measures. For example, 45% of the women favor forgiving student loans, as opposed to 2% of the men. The women were also more likely to favor what's called gender fluidity by a wide margin, and there were other differences. And of course, these same young women are also more likely to be found in college, where intellectual viruses sometimes escape from the lab and into the general population. To repeat, though, what's intriguing here is not the profile of the women. They are following the same path that the young have taken since Ronald Reagan was in office, namely the path that goes left. What is noteworthy is that many young men are plainly diverging from that journey. They are moving in a direction more congruent with Christian teaching, whether they recognize that or not. So it's time to wonder what's driving that divergence, because the findings in this journal essay are not isolated. They are just a microcosm of a wider reality out there that is taking shape. Young men, to paraphrase Henry Higgins, are tired of being told that a man should be more like a woman. Much has been written, for example, about the spectrum of what's called the new right. And in speaking of the new right, I am not advocating for it politically, nor for the old right, or the middle-aged right, or any right at all. I'm just listening. To my knowledge, for all the writing about the new right, no one has dwelt upon one of its most interesting features. The younger members of this movement are not only socially conservative, they are markedly more so than their libertarian-leaning boomer elders. So the new rightish organization, American Moment, for example, distills its mission into 3 pillars, one of which is strong families. The 2022 Statement of Principle of National Conservatism emphasizes the same key thought. Quote, "The traditional family is the source of society's virtues. Stable families with children are priorities of the highest order." Unquote. In fact, we can take this observation a step further. The disparate factors of today's political right differ on many points, but if they are held together by anything, any particular principle, it's that something has run seriously amok with the family, and that problem is now seeping into the public square. We see this even on the neo-pagan, Nietzsche-leaning end of the new right in the figure of Bronze Age pervert. And if you don't know who that is, I read so you don't have to, but I'm sure some of the young men here will know who I'm talking about. He too, for all the neo-paganism, indicts the establishment right once more for what he calls, quote, "it's powerless when it comes to stopping the destruction of the family," unquote. These same themes echo across today's populist resurgence, whose rank and file, again, is young men. And the same sounds carry outside the United States. In Germany, one member of the right-wing Alternative for Germany, for example, Maximilian Bra, is famous or notorious, depending on your view, for having said this, quote, "1 in 3 young men in Germany has never had a girlfriend. Are you one of them? Don't watch porn. Don't vote green. Go outside into the fresh air. Be confident. Real men are patriots. That's the way to find a girlfriend," unquote. In Italy, excuse me, similarly, President Giorgia Meloni regularly engages crowds with rhetoric about the importance of family. Last year, she gave a speech in which she deplored what she called, quote, "a widespread cultural approach that is generally hostile to the family," unquote. She's made that point many times. She also said, "Our government has made the birth rate and the family a top priority." In the United States, Ohio Senator and Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance is one of several younger populists unafraid to take on social issues that earlier generations of politicians have shunned, including, for example, the connection between fatherlessness and social dissolution. He also sees a relationship between declining marriage and birth rates and increased consumption of pornography. These being the kind of views he is pilloried for at the moment, I would like to quote some of what he said. He said, "We know that at least one cause of the low birth rate is that we have allowed, under the banner of libertarianism, pornography to seep even into our youngest minds through the channels of the internet. We have made a political choice that the freedom to consume pornography was more important than public goods like marriage and family and happiness. We can't ignore that we have made that choice, and we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we can make new choices in the future, unquote. This list could go on. And of course, one could dismiss such rhetoric as mere political posturing. But if so, the posturing is exactly the point. Today's successful populist politicians understand that there is now an audience out there for acknowledging suppressed truths about manhood, womanhood, and family. Almost anywhere one finds today's populism, one also finds insistence about the need to protect the family. So why is this happening? To venture a theory, it may just be that we have reached a tipping point in the personal and social chaos fomented from the 1960s onward. Perhaps some critical mass of young people, especially young men, have concluded from observation and experience that some kind of cultural restoration is needed. Or consider one more sign that today's kids, consider one more sign, the legions of young men creating traffic jams in one city after another as they turn out to attend talks by Jordan Peterson. And I'm not making up that illustration. I was on the 20-something floor of a building in downtown Houston one night, and I saw that the streets were clogged with cars. And I said, "What's happening? Are the Astros playing?" And I was told, no, Jordan Peterson is in town. Further, I relayed this story to a friend just 2 weeks ago, and she said, "Oh, it happened to me in LA." These young men are lining up for messages that secularist orthodoxy isn't giving them. And their contrary movement tells us something. Secularist triumph, anti-Christian triumph, woke triumph, none of these things are inevitable. In fact, the claim to inevitability is being falsified even as we speak. So, now let's turn to a second related sign of life. At least one other major feature of the post-1960s social status quo has changed, and this one during the past decade alone. It is no longer forbidden, outside the religious zone, to wonder aloud about the downside of the sexual revolution. Let's repeat, the sexual revolution is no longer a subject of social omerta. It is no longer exempt from public inspection the way it has been since the 1960s. And a lot of that inspection is not coming from Team Religious. This, too, is an amazing turn, including for those of us who have said exactly that for years, only to be met with silence or ridicule. And this is one positive sign that I have been privileged to witness up close. In 2012, Ignatius Press, Catholic Press, published a book I wrote called Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. Its thesis was that contrary to the secularist, triumphalist view dominant since the 60s, evidence has been mounting year by year that the sexual revolution was a serious net loss. The material gains made by women in the paid marketplace, the book argued, had to be balanced against other immaterial consequences, like the ongoing disruption of families on a scale never seen before. So, in a nutshell, the book argued that sexual consumerism has complicated relations between the sexes more than any event since Eve took the apple, and that those results are documented by instruments ranging from social science to popular culture, and that the toll of post-revolutionary chaos has fallen heaviest on the weakest of shoulders, from the unborn sacrificed in its name to the children and men and women scarred by its fallout. Now, to say that book disputed the going consensus is to understate. But the point of my story is not the book. It's what happened next. As expected, and as was gratifying, it was discussed in religious media. Also, as expected, it was completely ignored in the secular press and non-religious academia, despite the fact that its argument required no religious assumptions at all. But back then, this silence came as no shock. One friend told me, after bemoaning the terrible turn my career had taken, that the New York Times will never review a book from a religious publishing house anyway. And that was true. But a dozen years later, a dramatic turnaround is unfolding. New shoots of research are breaking through this same stony ground, and what was considered unsayable has become less so. We are getting somewhere. For starters, within the ranks of moral traditionalists, books, essays, and even conferences have proliferated during the past 10 years that challenge the dominant secular narrative about sex. Of particular note was a landmark symposium held in Washington, D.C. in 2018, co-sponsored by 4 Catholic organizations from all parts of the country, titled Second Thoughts on the Sexual Revolution. It featured testimony by physicians, attorneys, therapists, and other scholars, led by thinkers like Mary Rice Hasson, Jennifer Robach Morse, and Helen Alvarez. In addition, other powerful voices have also emerged to question today's post-revolutionary disorder, to name just a few: Carl Trueman, Erika Bakioki, theologians Charles Camozzi and Deborah Savage, Scott Yenner, journalists Brandon Showalter and Jonathan Van Maren, and this list could go on. In another development, perhaps the most unexpected, writers from outside religious orbits have lately produced skeptical analyses quite compatible with the main lines of argument in Adam and Eve after the pill. Writers Mary Harrington, Christine Emba of the Washington Post, and Louise Perry in England now make their skeptical cases to a wide audience, something that, to repeat, would have been unthinkable 12 years ago. To these examples, I would add another indictment of the sexual revolution that, in the long run, may be most significant. That is the brilliance of French novelist Michel Houellebecq, whose deadened, desperate postmodern men and women amount to poster children for the claim that the West took a disastrous turn on sex during the 20th century. As I have noted before, the sexual revolution amounts to a second industrial revolution. Sometime in the future, Houellebecq may become to that second revolution what Charles Dickens was to the first, the truth teller whose fiction sparked reform. No one would be more surprised by that outcome than Houellebecq. One more point about this second sign of life. Let's return for a moment to the subject of pornography. A dozen years ago, a near total omerta reigned over this subject. It was enforced by a coalition of libertines and libertarians that together silenced or intimidated would-be critics. And yet today, pornography is disparaged not only by religious conscientious objectors, but by a growing list of politicians, as already mentioned, and celebrities and other witnesses. FightTheNewDrug.com, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with that website, keeps a running list of Hollywood stars who have bravely taken a stand against smut, including, and not limited to, such headliners as Hugh Grant, Juliette Binoche, Chris Rock, Emma Thompson, and most dedicated of all, actor Terry Crews. My friends, this is the face of change. Now, let's look at a third sign of life that was practically non-existent until recently. This was touched on yesterday. We are living amid an explosion of educational entrepreneurship as parents of faith, and sometimes parents of no faith, seek escape hatches from institutionalized schooling and the toxic secularist dogma it disseminates. Already steadily increasing from the 1990s onward, homeschooling rose even more sharply after the pandemic, as was mentioned. By 2021, 5.4% of American students were being homeschooled. Another model also proliferating is hybrid homeschooling, which I'm sure many of you also know, in which students spend part of the week at home and part of the week in a co-op with other homeschooled students. Then there is classical K through 12 education, operating under rubrics like John Edwards yesterday, Great Hearts, Founders Academies, American Leadership, Classical Academies, etc. Between 2019 and 2023 alone, 264 new classical schools took root. By 2024, according to the consulting group Arcadia Education, the annual growth rate for these schools is 4.8%. And that number doesn't capture how many students are waiting in the wings for more schools. Charter schools have also surged. So what is happening here? In a word, parents wised up. As it turned out, the 2020 lockdowns and the consequent turn to screen schooling delivered an unexpected benefit. They made it almost impossible for mothers and fathers to remain ignorant about what their kids were being taught. And some of what they saw over their kids' shoulders repelled them. Listen to this statistic. According to a January 2024 survey by the National School Choice Awareness Foundation, 72% of the parents polled had considered new schools for their children in the previous year. 72%. That is a lot of mothers and fathers seeking alternatives to the toxins of woke, secularist schooling. And problems like indoctrination into the Gnostic esoterica of gender studies programs, racialist and other anti-religious hostility, and bullying, and worse, by growing numbers of unacculturated children and teenagers. It is surely no exaggeration to say that today's children and teenagers who are fortunate enough to opt out into these schools will be disproportionately represented in social and political leadership in the future. And that is also a good thing. This brings us to a fourth sign that's easy to miss in a time when religious liberty cases continue to rise and our most prestigious institutions remain captive to anti-religious zeal and gender delusion and rising anti-Semitism. Even so, a counterculture is growing among us, centered on a fascinating departure from religious history. Serious Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are in fellowship as never before. Let's think about that. The hostility toward the faithful, entrenched in legacy institutions, has unexpectedly but really generated a forcing crisis. And because of it, serious believers are cooperating with one another and expressing solidarity with one another in unprecedented ways. I submit that this social and religious fact, which lives right here in this assembly of ours today, is of overwhelming importance. The future of religious liberty in the United States is being written by this coalition. I have seen it in action myself too many times to count. on visits to flagship evangelical institutions like Houghton University in upstate New York, in conversations with tradition-minded Episcopalians and African Anglicans, at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention here in Nashville earlier this year, during time spent with evangelicals and Catholics together under the aegis of First Things magazine, and in many podcasts and interviews and emails exchanged with tradition-minded Protestants. This coalition lives, and it's not only Protestants. In October 2023, following the murders by Hamas in Israel, it was my privilege to be part of a conference at Franciscan University in Ohio that launched a new group, the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism. Within 2 days of putting our mission statement online, we had collected 500 signatures from all over the world, and this excluded clergy. In my speech that day, I shared the following thoughts that I would also like to share here, because they summarize some of the reality behind this fourth sign of life, this fellowship. I said, since October 7th, many universities in the United States and elsewhere have disgraced themselves. Some students have sided openly with the murder of innocents. Administrators have stayed mute out of cowardice. As is more visible with each passing day, it is not the atheists or the agnostics of the world who can be counted on to have the backs of Jews or others needing aid and solidarity. Rather, it is other people of the book. Solidarity with our brothers, our older brothers and sisters in faith, is not a fast track to affirmation. Solidarity may never win you likes anywhere. But as the historian Norman Davies put it in his introduction to a book called The Righteous, which was about Christians who helped save Jews in the Holocaust, quote, "There are righteous Poles who are known at Yad Vashem, and others whose names are known only to God," unquote. It does not matter whether our good deeds are inscribed for all to see, or whether they are known only to God. It only matters that we do them. I quote that because, as we know, the Jewish people were and are on the front lines of the battle between those who seek to worship God and those who would defy his laws. Sometimes that battle is literal. But for Christians, I think understanding and standing by our predecessors in faith is a moral have-to, especially now. So here is a suggested item for action. Let us hope that today, as millions of students return to colleges, our Christian colleges and our Christian student groups do not sit idly by as Jewish students are attacked and intimidated by social media mobs and real mobs. Franciscan University, where we launched this coalition, threw the door open to any Jewish students wanting to transfer. They fast-tracked any students who were not comfortable on the campuses that they had matriculated to and wanted to come to Franciscan. It was a beautiful model that I hope other Christian schools follow. Christian students should be as proud and standing as allies as some of our forebears were on the front lines of the civil rights movement. May they find the strength that they need. Now, obviously, Jews, Catholics, and Protestants are divided by serious theological issues, some of them existing for millennia. But it doesn't scant theology at large to point out that the only theology we need here is the story of the Good Samaritan. So, a fifth sign of life in our time is of a different order entirely. The problems of a secularizing, repaganizing world are increasingly making themselves visible. And the more that Americans and other people in the West come to understand that repaganization is the root cause of some of our most formidable social problems, the more do the odds of cultural reversal increase. The more believers convincingly tie our formidable problems to the recession of Christianity, the more our voices will be heard. This is not just an observation, it's a proposed strategy. Let me list 3 examples of how Christianity has recently received incremental, but real and unexpected attention. In March of this year, a short video by Richard Dawkins went viral, and no wonder. In it, the world's alpha atheist confessed an affinity for at least some aspects of Christianity in a way that shocked followers and detractors alike. He said, quote, "I feel at home in the Christian ethos. I count myself a cultural Christian. It's a fundamentally decent religion. I like to live in a culturally Christian country," unquote. Dawkins went on to declare that given a choice between living under Islam and living under Christianity, he would choose Christianity anytime. And of course, that juxtaposition became the focus of controversy. But what was remarkable was what he said about cultural Christianity. Also recently, another leading British intellectual, Douglas Murray, gave an interview that surprised in a different way. Murray, who describes himself as an uncomfortable agnostic, noted that several serious people of his acquaintance, people he respected, had recently converted to Christianity, in this case, Catholicism. He further noted that they were opting for the strictest forms of observance, the Latin Mass, etc. And reflecting on some current conditions in the church, he also said this, quote, "It saddens me that a religion with its inheritance and all that it has to offer would offer the world the most watered-down version of itself," unquote. Surprising. Example 3. Columbia University professor Mark Lilla recently published an essay attacking Catholic integralists. But again, that wasn't what was of interest. He said this, "In the past decade, interest in Catholic ideas and practice has been growing among right-leaning intellectual elites, and it is not unusual to meet young conservatives at Ivy League institutions who have converted or renewed their faith in college." Quote. Now, his piece goes on to express uneasiness at this outcome because he is concerned that these students will be corrupted by the nefarious integralists. But what's interesting, again, is not his misgivings, but something else. He's pointing to a truth. That is the truth that conversion and observance are no longer unheard of on Ivy League campuses and are, in fact, on the increase. And I know this as well from experience, having attended Cornell University some decades ago, when there was none of this kind of movement. Cornell is now home to 2 different institutions, one Catholic, the other Protestant. The Protestant one, Chesterton House, is a residential community, in fact, things that were unheard of in the 1980s. So this, too, can't help but be good news. So here's a theory that only time will prove or disprove. Maybe, just maybe, these passing nods to Christianity by 3 prominent minds of the Anglosphere are ahead of their time. Maybe even non-believers are beginning to see what believers have been saying all along, which is that Christian decline is making the world worse. After all, it's not just the pretty buildings and the Latin prayers that will go missing if Christianity recedes from the West, but much more fundamental goods, including social goods. Let me offer a couple of examples of these that might help us believers to make this case to people. First, the post-sexual revolution weakening of both family and faith is producing atomized, maladjusted individuals on a scale that defies easy solution. In my 2019 book, Primal Screams, I argue that the legacy of the sexual revolution, which is the single most formative revolution of our lifetimes, can be summarized in one word: fewer. Fewer brothers, sisters, fathers at home, fewer cousins, aunts, uncles, and other extended family. More and more people are born into a post-revolutionary disorder whose very signature is fewer people to love, to trust, and to learn from, or whose company you can simply enjoy. And that same love deficit is further deepened by the unchurching of the young. Christianity means, among other things, that even if your family is dysfunctional, you can still find refuge in a religious family. You can find a place whose founder taught us that we are brothers and sisters, united under a loving Father. What we have to understand is that many young Americans, not only Americans, no longer have access to ways of answering that eternal question, who am I? Their earthly families are volatile, and their place in a supernatural order is unknown to them. In short, more and more do not have either a religious identity or a robust family identity. This is what the sexual revolution really did. It knocked out that horizontal way of answering the question, who am I? I'm a sister, I'm a mother, I'm a great aunt, et cetera, et cetera. It also knocked out that vertical way, pointing upward, of answering the question, who am I? By, I am a child of God. This widespread identity crisis, which is, again, a love crisis, forces many people, especially the young, to seek community in the only way left to them, identity politics. And that is not only a personal problem, but a social problem. Why? Because identity politics says we are victims. We cannot trust others except for victims like ourselves. Identity politics declares peaceful coexistence with the wider community to be somehow unwanted or impossible. It produces cancel culture. All of these modes of being are antithetical to a functioning society, or even a society that is pleasant to live in. In place of a Christian creed that tells people to love their enemies, forgive those who harm them, and welcome straying members back to the fold, identity politics says instead that you should hate your oppressor, use power against those who harm you, and ruin the lives of people who have transgressed. Now, which one of these creeds makes for a more amicable society or less rancorous one? The question answers itself. And here I must digress with a little introduction to identity politics that many people are not aware of. The first time that phrase was ever used was in 1977 in a manifesto by African-American feminists. And in that manifesto, which is one of the saddest documents of modern times, these women say that they are giving up on the men in their lives. They speak of children, but not fathers or brothers. They say that the only people who can be trusted to have our backs are people exactly like us. It's a profound cry of loss, this document that gives us the phrase identity politics. And there is a straight line from that declaration in 1977 to the manifesto of Black Lives Matter, subsequently taken down from the web, for deploring heteronormativity and for similarly not even mentioning the words fathers and brothers. So this is where identity politics comes from. It comes from a place of profound loss. This perversely helps us to make the case. Secularization and repaganization are not net neutrals. They are undermining the ability of many Western people to function in society and live peacefully with their fellow citizens. So here's another example of how the flight from God is making the world worse, the baby bust. Amid the recent furor over J.D. Vance's crack about childless cat ladies, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, a few people did manage to point out that babies do matter to some large social outcomes, like fiscal solvency and even national security. That is true. But what's also true is something that got lost in that shuffle. Babies are good, period. In other words, beneath today's passing arguments about rising sterility lies a metaphysical struggle. It is a struggle between people who think creation is good, call them Christians, and people who think otherwise. It is an iron law of demography. This obtains across religious faiths, that religious people have larger families and secular people have smaller ones, if they have families at all. A world in which the joy of babies and children becomes boutique is a world diminished and crabbed, and it's a gross mismatch for the loving side of our nature. But that is the world that the secularist no to creation will usher in. And I submit they won't like living in it either. As we wonder about whether turning that reality around is even possible, we should bear in mind a few interesting facts. Moral renaissance happens, and it happens in unexpected places and times. One of my research interests these days is in rural upstate New York, where I come from. In the early 1800s, like today, it was a wildly beautiful, forbidding, largely empty part of the world. Whoever would have predicted, in the years before the burned over district was named, that several global religions and others would rise in tandem from the rocky ground around Rochester or the rolling hills of central New York. And yet this place, among all the unlikely tracts in the New World, is where the Second Great Awakening came from. Or consider a totally different, other unlikely cultural reclamation that occurred in waves beginning in the late 1800s and continuing through the mid-1900s, the Oxford movement. Led by artists and intellectuals, this religious and intellectual renaissance flourished at Oxford on and off for decades. It included, obviously, Catholics, but also Protestants. And in the category of unlikeliest winner, remember, this happened at Oxford, which was a place where Catholics had been forbidden to matriculate for hundreds of years. But it was here that the fabled society known as the Inklings was born, the intellectual and social club that was home to C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and other great thinkers. The ranks of converts during those years grew so much that they fill an entire book, Joseph Pierce's Literary Converts. And if Renaissance were possible at Oxford following centuries of persecution and discrimination, what does that tell us? I think it tells us that we can't rule out another Oxford awakening in the future, maybe even centered in the Ivy League. A sixth sign of life in our midst is this. Illuminated by the very chaos of our time, something else is becoming more visible. It is a phoenix, and its name is vindication. in a way that is not widely understood as yet, and someday will be. The political and social turmoil of Western nations today tells us something crucial. It amounts to implicit vindication of core teachings of people of the book. How? Because living without the book is diminishing people. It is crippling them. It is making them lonely. It is making them not only miserable, but small. Consider the contrast. Christianity teaches that the family is sacred and that women are co-participants in the sacred act of creation. The secularist creed says the family is optional at best and a hothouse of pathologies at worst, and that women are its primary victims. Christianity says, again, that we are brothers and sisters on earth with unique eternal destinies, made in the image of nothing less than God. The secularist creed says that we are random collections of molecules to be tolerated or disposed of however the strongest in our societies see fit, from killing in the womb to killing in the nursing home. In this struggle between two ways to live, there is simply no contest about which is the more magnanimous, transcendent, and beautiful. And this is the fact we must never, ever forget. We should be shouting it from the pulpits and from the rooftops. Many Christians are discouraged these days. We all know the reasons why, and most of us can recite those reasons in our sleep by now. My message here today is that maybe the time for recitation is over. The time for joyous defiance has begun. As we embark on it, it is more important than ever to hold fast to a truth that is sometimes elusive. Contrary to what we are told by forces hostile to the faith, Christianity is not being rejected because science has overruled it, or because we're smarter than our religious ancestors were, or because its rules have somehow been superseded, or because anything about it is wrong. No, Christianity is being rejected because it is more demanding than people weakened by the sexual revolutions in discipline want it to be. It is rejected not by our best and brightest, but by those who think with their pants, as my friend Scott Yenner put it. I have tried for days to think of a better line than that and failed. It's just too based. So, living in opposition to religion, as both the Nietzschean radical right and the Marcusean radical left do, is not liberating people. The evidence piles up around us daily. The many troubled voices rising up from our streets and our society do not rage in vain. They bear a message for the rest of us, whether they understand it or not. They are sending up primal screams for a world more ordered than many of today's people now know, including a world ordered to some of Christianity's essential principles, like mercy, community, and redemption. Someday, more souls will come to understand and reject today's spiritually impoverished status quo. Someday, another less quoted observation of Pope Benedict's may come to pass, something he said in that same interview mentioned at the beginning, that when the trial of this sifting is past, a great power will flow from a more spiritualized and simplified church. When that happens, the people of tomorrow will look backward for the signs that preceded it And they will find, for the reasons enumerated today, that some are already flashing in our own here and now. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful points. Thank you for sharing those with us. I'm concerned about complacency. It seems like in a room like this, we've got a lot of folks that maybe are higher than average in their awareness of what's going on, the cultural battles that you speak of, even words like based. A lot of us know what that means here. I'm worried about the normies, people who don't spend their time thinking much about all this stuff. They're going to movies, they're going to their jobs without leaning into Chicken Little and the sky is falling all the time. How do we get people in out of what I sense is their complacency over some of the things that are going on? I don't know how we say, hey, look, Christianity and its decline in Western civilization is it's bad for civilization, and eventually people will figure that out when a lot of folks aren't even thinking about that. They're just thinking about their basic lives. So how do we avoid complacency with regard to what you're talking about?
So my general point is that we are surrounded by empirical, figurative ammunition that we can use out there because of the brokenness of the world combined with the suffering since the sexual revolution. We know we're not living in a better time and place, and we don't have to look backward to the 1950s, which I don't remember, and hardly anybody in this room remembers anymore. I mean, we have other means of making our case other than nostalgia for a golden age. And one story that often comes to mind when I think about how to make that case to people who are not like the people in this room is this. So one day I was talking with two young women who were graduates of elite universities, neither of them religious, both secular. And I said, what's going on campus? What's the biggest problem on campus these days for romance? They both said simultaneously, porn. That took me by surprise. And they were very serious about it. And so I said, well, maybe somebody should make a T-shirt that says porn-free boy and, distribute it around. I was trying to make a joke because it felt a little heavy. And one of them said, if there were such T-shirts and such boys, girls would follow them everywhere. Now that was very interesting because it gave me the opening to talk to them about something they didn't know. I said, do you know the one institution that has raised its hand and said this stuff is bad? Religion says this is bad. They didn't even know that. They hadn't connected the dots that way. And without being heavy-handed, it allowed us to have a little conversation about what view does, say, Christianity take of men and women and their proper behaviors and roles, et cetera. And I could see that they were thinking. They were thinking. So what I'm trying to do here similarly is to say, when we look at the disorders of our time, when we look at, for example, a mass shooter who leaves a note saying, only, I have no family, I have no friends. We are in possession of a great truth that people like that don't have and that needs to be shared. And so I think if we start by acknowledging some of the suffering out there, not making fun of it. It's very easy to make fun of snowflakes and make fun of a lot of what happens on campus. But I suspect that underneath it is suffering. And if we start by acknowledging that, trying to get people to see they might have the wrong name attached to this suffering, we might get somewhere. So that's my approach to people outside places like this.
Thanks. I have a question about the concept of identity politics, which I don't like. And I know that you've written a lot on it, so maybe you can clarify. The problem I have with identity politics as a concept is that it uses identity as its governing concept. So the idea being that, because it seems like identity politics is just politics, right? Like I'm joining with people who are similar to me in some way, to fight a group of people or to stop a group of people that's different in some way. But that's such a broad category. Like, is it identity politics for non-murderers to say, we want to discriminate against the murderer community? That's a bit different from, Protestant saying we want to discriminate against Catholics or Jews or whatever. So is there utility to identity politics? That's the question. Or is it overly vague and unhelpful?
There is, for example, identity politics of the right. In my book, Primal Screams, I talk about this. I kind of go through the biographies of names I will not name here, of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and others, and point out that their biographies actually are a perfect match for the biographies of the people writing the racialist stuff, the anti-racism stuff. That is to say, almost all of these people are coming from fatherless homes. Striking fact about something that part of the right and that part of the left has in common. So maybe we differ. I do take the identity confusion seriously, because I think, as that example may indicate, that the people who are drawn into these groups, by and large, don't know who they are. There was a children's book called Are You My Mother by P.D. Eastman. Does anybody remember it? It's a wonderful book. It's about a baby bird that goes around to different animals saying, "Are you my mother? Are you my mother? Are you my mother?" And it has a happy ending. A lot of stories in our time don't, because they go like this. Well, are you my brother? I don't know. Our parents were married once, but now they're both divorced, and you were his kid and I was her kid. Are you my brother? Are you my aunt? If you and my uncle have moved on to other partners, are we still related? You multiply this kind of confusion by the millions, and you end up in the society we're in today, where people don't know who they are. So I think on paper, you could argue that identity politics is a vague and benign sounding thing that sometimes has malignant manifestations. But I suspect that the obsession with it is coming from a very deep place.
Other questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. I was thinking about that old song from Peggy March. What is it? I love him, I love him, I love him, and where he goes, I'll follow, I'll follow, I'll follow. And it's such a sweet song. And you think, well, if you have a woman as a man, she follows you, and that gives you confidence, right? And today there's so much distrust between the men and the women. And you mentioned that there's this big, they're going opposite directions, the males under 30 and the women under 30. When should we expect the women to follow? And what are the main hurdles for the women to follow the men who say that, yeah, we got to be more manly, we have to reject all these things that destroy family and so forth?
I think the biggest impediment to healthy relations between the sexes these days is the collapse in social learning, by which I mean what has happened in a world where people no longer can count on having brothers and sisters and fathers and uncles and aunts, etc. That word fewer that I keep using goes to this point. What does it mean that so many girls are afraid of men? Boys. So many women and girls are afraid of men and boys. There was this meme, I guess, recently about the bear and the man. You all know what I'm talking about. What would you rather find yourself with alone in the woods, a bear or a man? And the majority of women were saying the bear, because the man is going to be harmful. Now, where does this come from? I think it comes from a world where a lot of young women have not had examples of fathers, brothers, male cousins, uncles in their lives. Because if you have those things in your life, if you have a robust family of numbers, then you learn things about the opposite sex. And I think part of what we're seeing in this terror that I think is genuine, saying that all men are rapists and all men are bad, is just coming from not knowing differently. And similarly, on the men's side, in a world where a lot of them are watching pornography before they even hold a girl's hand, what they are learning about women is completely false. And so those I would see as the two biggest barriers to overcome. How do you restore social learning in a world where a lot of people don't have large or healthy or robust families anymore? That being the main thing. And I don't think any of this is insurmountable, but it's like anything else. We have to name the animals to know what they are. We have to put the right labels on things. We have a lot of young people running around the country who think that their affliction is something like the gender binary, right? Or heteronormativity, or some other abstraction. And I think they are indeed very injured and damaged, but not by those things, not by things that were made up in the gender studies lab. No, they are worse off than their predecessors were because there are many fewer people in their lives who they can count on to love them and have their backs. There's a love deficit and a social deficit out there that I don't think anything but religion can address.
Thank you so much. I have a practical example related to the identity politics I would love your advice on, particularly related to women and women of color choosing to, preferring to be with people like us. We serve with a lot of women of color in the community that we are at Hope Clinic, and there is this natural preference that these women have been taught to be with people like them because that's who is safe. And as a person who's trying to provide care for these individuals, I want them to feel safe. How do I breach that gap that has been so indoctrinated? Like when you were sharing about the 1977 roots of identity politics, like it's so ingrained, like she doesn't even think about it. How do I breach that gap knowing that like I may not have someone to serve you who looks just like you, but this is still a safe person for you? I hear the rhetoric and it's hard to break through, especially when someone is in crisis.
There's no easy answer to that one. I think in a case like that, the power of your example is the strongest thing you have on your side. The more the people you serve see that you're serving them, the more they will wonder where that selflessness comes from. So that it may be a case where people can't be argued into something, but they can learn by watching. If people could be argued into things, we wouldn't have the world we have today, because we have 60 years of social science showing the harms of the fatherless home, for example. We have 60 years of social science about why marriage makes you live longer and why married people are happier, et cetera. And I'm not making fun of these things. I've had to read a lot of them. What I'm saying is that if that's all it took to convince people, people would be convinced. So we're back to what one of the popes said about needing witnesses and teachers, and witnesses who are teachers, and that's what you're doing.
Thank you again, Mrs. Eberstadt. I'm thinking of another hard case. How do I respond to the Christians in my life who are hesitant to bring their Christian values into politics because they've heard some of the excesses of Christian nationalism and that as a buzzword, or people saying that the US government will save souls, or sort of out there things like that? How do I respond to those Christians to make a distinction between that version of Christianity in politics and just the civilization decline and the importance of moral renaissance?
I mean, one question in front of the whole world, not that everyone's observing it, is, are we better off for living without these rules? And I think you can have a conversation about that. About politics, I always start from the premise that it's not the most interesting or important thing for Christians. And maybe emphasizing that helps too. We're told not to put our trust in princes. We know that we're not going to get to heaven on earth, which is what a lot of the people who put their bets on politics think. Maybe just reiterating basic truths like that help.
So we know that Satan takes every good gift that God gives us, and he convinces us that it's neither a gift nor good. And we hear a lot about toxic masculinity, which I'm sure is a real thing, but we hear very little about toxic feminism, where Satan has, in the name of creating more female CEOs and having more fair pay, has convinced a generation of women that the gifts that he gave, the body that he gave women that create life, sustains life, nourishes life, is somehow an impediment and an oppression that a patriarchal society has put upon them. And there's this, the earlier transgender movement was women wanting to be men, and men wanting to allow that. I guess my question is there a female Jordan Peterson that you can point us to?
Female Jordan Peterson, no. Although it would be interesting to see traffic jams on account of it. I agree with you. I would only add that it is not the fault of those girls who have been told that their career comes first and that their fertility is a problem and that motherhood would be a problem for them, etc. It is not their fault. It's very often their parents' fault because very often they are getting this at home. And when I try to address this one-on-one, I start from the premise, well, you don't think money is everything when it comes to X, Y, and Z, right? You don't think money is everything. Do you think health is more important than money? Most people would say yes. Do you think saving the planet is more important than money? A lot of people in that cohort would say yes. Well, then why is it that postponing material satisfaction for the sake of a family, why isn't that on your list of where money comes second? It's a strategy.
Thank you, Mrs. Eberstadt,
Thank
very
you.
much.